Okay, thank you. So a lot of my work is actually quite micro. A lot of my work is working on how to reduce violence, how to get people from wanting to join armed groups such as gangs or rebel groups, if they're joined, how to get them out, how to deal with victims of violence, and how to help people recover. Um, but you can't avoid sort of becoming fascinated and trying to understand how these armed organizations work, and in some ways the very sophisticated structures that they've built. And so both in some sense, like what are the economics, what's the labor economics of these organizations? What are the personnel economics? What is the industrial organization of this space, especially this market space, when we especially when we're thinking about criminal organizations that are engaged, that are fundamentally businesses, and what is the politics between these organizations? Like, how do they coordinate? How do they collude? How do they fight, or how do they avoid fighting? And so what I'm going to do today is something that's a little bit different. It's sort of a paper I've been struggling to write for years because I don't really know how to write this kind of big picture paper, and it's going to draw on industrial organization theory. It's going to draw on international relations theory. It's going to draw on political economy. It's going to draw on personnel economics of the firm and so forth, just to sort of help us understand this ecosystem. And I'm going to talk about the city where I've been working for the longest, which is Medellín, Colombia. But in some ways, a lot of these lessons apply to well-organized, profitable, hierarchical gang structures throughout the Americas. And I'll bring in some examples today. So I'm not going to talk about what you mostly hear about, which are transnational cartels, who are the organizations that are moving illegal products across borders. I'm not going to talk about warlords like, rebel warlords in Eastern Congo or Liberia or somewhere else who are selling lumber or gold in order to or drugs to fuel their insurgency and their grab on power. I'm not going to talk about narco states, which is whether it's Venezuela or Guinea-Bissau or other states that have essentially where the top leadership has become captured by transnational cartels. What I am going to focus on are mostly what I think of as urban systems of organized crime, which are arguably as common or more common and also potentially more important to people's everyday life, especially in this hemisphere. And so Chicago, this would be the small fragmented gangs that dominate, that influence life in so many neighborhoods today, and in their huge and hierarchical, much better organized structures in the 1980s and 1990s really defined a lot of what was going on in the city. It would include Rio and the warfare that's been going on between the state and between organized criminal systems for the last 20 years. It would define a lot of Mexican cities, not the transnational cartels, but the organizations that are selling drugs on the corner, that are collecting extortion, that are organizing life. It's one of my collaborators, Ben Lessing, in political science, estimates that maybe 1 in 10 households in Latin America receive some form of criminal rule by a local gang. All right, and so these are not the transnational cartels; these are these urban systems of organized crime. And I'm just going to try to increase attention on them because these are the systems that are really growing across Latin America. I've been working mostly in Medellín, Colombia. This is Colombia's second city in the sense of it being a commercial and industrial heartland. It's relatively wealthy. People enjoy about $23,000 per head in terms of income in purchasing parity terms. Virtually every street has lights and water and paved roads and property rights and government services and police officers and so forth. But likewise, every single residential neighborhood in the lower and the middle income level, and even to some extent some of the upper middle income neighborhoods, every single neighborhood also has a neighborhood organization called a combo, which is essentially the neighborhood drug selling gang. And this is our mapping of about 400 combos in the city against a heat map of income. And so, it's not surprising. Like in many cities, you tend to see neighborhood gangs, and this is a centroid of, in some sense, their main headquarters are a known location. We don't know their exact territory for all 400 combos. Right? We haven't quite mapped out all of that yet. But every square inch of every residential neighborhood at the middle and low income level is a combo territory. The borders are well known, not just to the combo members, but to the residents. And everybody knows who the members of the local combo are. And most of them have existed for decades. And you'll even find them in a handful of even very high-income neighborhoods. Like this is, if you've ever gone to Medellín, you might have hung out in Parque Lleras, and that's Parque Lleras. Parque Lleras has a combo as well. But for the most part, they're concentrated in these low and middle income neighborhoods. And you have to hold two images of a combo in your mind. On the one hand, most combo members are between the ages of 16 and maybe 26. And so, and they're rough and tumble and they, here's them posing for a newspaper photographer, all right? But they're actually quite sophisticated firms, right? Of roughly 15 to 45 people with the leader. So this is a picture I took of my collaborator and I interviewing a leader of one of these combos, all right? And we've blacked out his face of him and one of his deputies, but he's probably in his mid-30s. He has some gray hair. In addition to running the local drug selling operations and drug corners, and in addition to collecting extortion, which is not necessarily extortion because they actually are providing a degree of security. So they're providing services. In some ways, it's more like a tax for the provision of security services. They've built this. This is one of the most organized combos in the city, which is one reason we sought them out. But they built this little craft center for kids to make crafts. Behind that is their yogurt processing center, and behind that is their recycling center. And over here, I don't really like to give this factoid anymore because it gives fuel to what's happening in the U.S. government right now. But just over here to the right is a community pool that was built by the NGO the combo runs, which they received a USAID grant. And so there's a big sign that sort of says brought to you by the American people. And so these are relatively sophisticated social, community, and business organizations. And so, what I'm going to talk about today, and as usual, I think, I probably have more slides than I have time. So at times I'm going to jump through topics and we can come back to them in questions. And at some point, I guess we'll hit 45 minutes and I'll just stop talking because we could go on for hours and hours about how these systems function. But what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about both like how these firms work, what the market structure is like, why they have political structures, and the evolution of violence and competition over time, and how they've learned to cooperate, right? And I'm going to give some examples about how some of that same evolution is taking place in other cities, and some of that same evolution took place in Chicago. And then I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about some things that I think are general from the Medellín case. That what are the forces we observe that push towards criminal consolidation and integration, so larger and larger firm structures. But what's leading in so many cities around the world, especially in this hemisphere, to these nonetheless being very fragmented organizations? What leads them, what prevents so many criminal organizations from finding peace and collusion when there are these natural incentives amidst their fragmented? Why do so many fight when there's very powerful incentives not to? And what is it about Medellín that has helped the criminal organizations create one of the most peaceful cities in the hemisphere? And that's going to lead up to, if we have time at the end, I'll talk about the terrible trade-off. Where if you're in a city with these gangs, whether it's Chicago or Rio or Medellín, you have a terrible trade-off in some ways between, do you want strong organizations and peace, or do you want weak and fragmented organizations and violence? And how, in some sense, having the best of both worlds might be feasible, but is very, very, very difficult. Most of what we know for today, we're running surveys of 30,000 13-year-olds over time to track who's going into gangs. We are running citywide surveys every year of maybe a quarter of all blocks in the city, and so just really measuring all criminal activity at all sorts of levels. But for today, most of what we know comes from qualitative interviews. So we've interviewed, starting about 7 years ago, when we, accidentally discovered that, we discovered very quickly that low-level gang members, either on the street or in prison, would not talk to us. They didn't feel secure. But middle and high-ranking gang leaders felt very secure in talking to us. We're seeking legitimacy. We're very frustrated that nobody understood how influential and powerful and how they were and how they worked, and actually saw talking to us not only as sort of interesting and maybe a relief from boredom in prison, but also as serving their interest in the sense of resolving information asymmetries. They would really like the city government and the police to understand how this works better. And so we've been interviewing now, we're probably now up to about 160 in about 85 criminal groups. Most of these people we've just interviewed once or twice. Some we've interviewed repeatedly. And so what have we learned? Well, here's an org chart from we have org charts on 12 combos at this moment. This one's very typical. It's headed by a coordinador, so a coordinator. It has its main business line. Most of its staff are in the drug corners. This one happens to organize its drug corners separately by drugs. So there's a separate coordinator and corner for marijuana. Perico is like a low-grade cocaine that's sold. The good stuff is exported. And then 2C is basically a compound mix of a bunch of synthetics. We could get into this in questions, but the organized criminal structures have conspired to keep fentanyl and opiates out of the city because they just don't see it as their interest. And they're considered, some combos sell crack or what they call bazuco, but they're starting to consider barring bazuco because they don't think it's in their interests. They also have a money lending business, which is small, right? And by the way, this isn't one person per. There's probably several people per in each of these sort of sub hierarchies. So there's I think 35 members in this group. They also have a small number of people that are basically collecting extortion and then providing security in return. And so this extortion deputy, his name is actually the relationist in Spanish. All right, and so he's the community relationist. All right, so he's not the extortion deputy, he's the relationist. And these guys are relatively well paid. One of the factoids about gangs that most people know, if most people know anything about the labor economics of gangs, they've read the Levitt Venkatesh paper on a drug selling gang in Chicago from like the late 90s. And that particular drug selling gang happened to pay below minimum wage to its drug dealers. And so that's become sort of a factoid about drug gangs in general, even though that paper was careful to note that this was this firm went out of business. They didn't last. Maybe this wasn't a great business model, right? You don't study like successful businesses by going to Enron, right? You want like you want the NVIDIA of gangs maybe, right? But also like they even noted that the neighboring gangs didn't have this strategy, right? So most gangs do not pay their workers below minimum wage. There are huge rents to be made from selling drugs, especially if you can coordinate prices, collude on prices, and create monopolistic rents. There's no property rights that enforces the position of the coordinator, right? So the coordinator exists either because he has powerful people backing him, because he's extremely strong himself, or because he sort of kept everybody happy. So he operates against a revolution constraint. What do you do to sort of keep that revolution or a coup from happening? Is you distribute the gains to some degree. So yes, the coordinator gets a huge share of the rents, but those are shared. And so, the coordinator's in the top 1% of the city's income distribution, but even these sort of low level of operatives, many of whom are basically 16 to 20, are probably in the top fifth of earners in the city. Okay, and the low level entry positions, the carriers and the lookouts, so Carrito is one, all right, they're not making a lot of money, but they're 14 years old or 15 years old and they're working part-time. Okay, and once you move up into here, you're probably a long-term salaried position. At this low level, especially of Carritos, maybe at this low level, there's some turnover, right? So people are entering at 14, 15, 16, 17. They're starting out in these low-level positions. They're working part-time. There might be 3 or 4 or 5 of them. They don't like it, maybe, so they leave. They're not responsible, so the coordinator gets rid of them. It's sort of like at McDonald's. There's a lot of turnover. Most teenagers are kind of useless, right? And they don't know what they want to do, all right? And so some number of them moves up into the structure and then they remain and they're permanent salaried employees. And what they do, they don't just retail drugs and they don't just extort the retailers. They also, these guys are also engaging in a whole bunch of other, essentially, I would say other sort of semi-legal types of occupations. So they might be doing loan sharking. So this gang did money lending within the structure, and so the residual claimant on the money lending profits was the coordinator. But very often they might just let they might say, well, actually, you get the money lending operation, you get to sell yogurt, you're going to go around to the supermarkets and you can sell the arepas, like sort of the Colombian tortilla that, you can sell eggs, you can sell bar shots, all right, or you can have someone sell it for you. And maybe you're not the sole provider of these things in the neighborhood, but you have a certain amount of power, and all of the supermarkets are, of course, going to sell your arepas or sell your eggs alongside everybody else's. You don't necessarily control the whole market. You don't make monopolistic profits, but you make a lot of money off the volume. All right, and by doing that, but the thing is we're going to let you do that as a single entrepreneur. You're going to do that. You're going to be the residual claimant on profits, and we're not going to take that money from you. Right? We're just going to distribute licenses, and that's going to be a substitute for salary. And so the way I'm going to pay you, so even though you're getting well paid in terms of your salary, on top of that, I'm distributing these benefits in terms of licenses. And why do I do that? Well, lots of reasons, right? It's really hard, right? So what's, and we're going to come back to this, what's the number one problem you face as a criminal firm? You can't write anything down, right? So somebody has to hold all the payroll in their head, all the numbers in their head. Okay, and to do that, that's going to limit the number of businesses that you can sort of effectively manage with economies of scale as a coordinator. So keeping track of licensing of yogurt sales is just not going to happen. Okay, the other thing is that there's really not a lot of agency problems in drug retailing or extortion collection. With extortion collection, we've renegotiated months or years ago how much each shop pays. And so I just need you to go out and collect it. I know how many shops there are. I know how much money. You just have to bring me that money. It's not that hard. Drug selling is the same deal. Like, look, I'm going to give you this amount of cocaine and this amount of marijuana and this amount of 2C in the morning. And at the end of the day, you either bring me back the product or you bring me back the product times the street price, which, by the way, not only have I set, but we've coordinated. So there's very little room for you to screw this up. And people come and buy it, whether you're like a successful, you don't have to go and give the sales pitch, right? So yes, there's some agency problems, but basically you don't really need there's not a lot of moral hazard and adverse selection that you have to take care of on a day-to-day basis. But there's tons of agency problems with like running this consumer market. And so just besides the idea that you can't write everything down, as a coordinator, you can only manage so much. In some ways, you get rid of a lot of those moral hazard and adverse selection problems by reducing someone's salary and paying them in licenses instead, and then letting them entrepreneurially generate their profits, right? So it's a really sort of unique firm structure that's driven in part by this constraint of, I can't write things down. And we're going to see this again and again, that it's the number one thing that sort of drives the theory of the firm and the whole market structure is maybe not a lot of the classic agency problems and make or buy or other things that come from industrial organization, some of which matter. But actually it's this fundamental problem, which is you have someone constantly trying to expropriate you, which is the state. And so you need to guard against and build your entire organizational and market design sort of around that constraint. Okay, so what is that market structure? Well, like many cities, there's a hidden hierarchical structure of crime. So there's 400 combos, representing about 8,000 to 12,000 young men. But above them are 17 to 19, depending how you want to count, mafia-like organizations, also about 15 to 45 people each, that each have essentially that each have a set of combos that are part of their confederation. All right, the combos are mostly autonomous organizations to these mafias, which are sometimes called razones. Razón is like it's like a Spanish term for almost like the corporation. So these are the big business. They're not big business in terms of number of employees. They're big business in the sense that they're not extorting the, They're not extorting the bus lines and the local retailers. They're extorting the mall or the big construction site for a lot of money. They're not retailing drugs on the street. They're the wholesalers, right? So they're buying the drugs from rural producers and international cartels, and then they're distributing those drugs to their combos. Okay, and so this relationship between the combo and the razón is partly a retailer to wholesaler. All right, but as I'm going to describe in a moment, it's also that the razón is also going to solve a whole bunch of political and coordination problems for combos. Okay, and so what we get is, here's we've mapped out, there's essentially these 17 to 19 razones. They're organized into two main factions, right? Where you essentially have one dominant rason leader leading the alliance of the other razones. You've got some independent razones, but they tend to caucus with one side or the other. All right, and so they've got 400 combos organized under these 15 to 20 razones, organized into two factions, and those factions bargain at a table. I mean, it's not a physical table because many of these top leaders are in prison, and so it's over the phone, it's through intermediaries, but sometimes they call it the table or they call it the office, la oficina. Okay, and you can see that most of these razones are organizing geographically contiguous combos. Right now, sometimes this is downtown, so this is several may have downtown combos that they control. Some of these guys, I think this guy has this territory over here as well. So not everything's geographically contiguous, but they're doing this partly because there's just tremendous political coordination benefits that I'm going to get to. All right, and this is really, really valuable to the combo. Most of the combos are autonomous from their razones. In the language of industrial organization, we'd say there's tight relational contracts. So they're independent firms where the coordinator of that combo is from that neighborhood, the members are from that neighborhood, the coordinator's selected from among the members. It's not exactly a democratic election, but it might actually be, there's some, they in some sense, the razón is not choosing the coordinator. All right, there's some internal process for determining that. So it's a little bit like Toyota, the manufacturer, and Toyota dealerships. You're in this long run, very formal supplier-seller relationship, but the dealer franchises are separate from that middle producer. Okay, there's only one or two cases. So in the case of Los Triana up here, and to some extent La Terraza, where they're much more vertically integrated firms. So the Triana have done something very unusual in the city, that each of its combos, all right, it appoints the heads of the combo, and it rotates those heads around so that they don't develop too much influence or capture. All right, and they regulate what the combos do very well. So they're almost one well-integrated firm of several hundred employees. Okay, and this is unusual because it means they're not organized into this cell-like structure whereby if one combo leader is captured, the whole thing can unravel. And they do have to start writing things down. They're also one of the few razones we haven't been able to talk to anybody. We have very, very few contacts. They're very tight. Okay, and so we don't know how they've managed this. By reputation and through other things, we think basically they've managed to, they do write things down. They have a finance department. They have an HR department, which is very unusual. All right, and they do have really, really tight control over the extortion. And they're the residual claimant on a lot of these other things. It's one of the more repressive parts of the city to live in. And probably the way they do this is by buying off the police. So they still face that same expropriation constraint, but they protected themselves and insulated themselves in a way that other gangs have not from this predation. All right, and so they're able to have a vertically integrated firm and grab as the leadership and as the razón more of the profits and really squeeze the combos and squeeze the residents, probably through corruption. Generally, that's been hard to do because the mayor rotates. The new mayor comes in every 4 years. There's no such thing as, there's term limits, one term limit. New police chief is coming in every 2, 3, 4 years. Very hard to capture elite levels of government. So how they've managed this, we don't really know. The political structures, though, are arguably even more important. And there's a couple of incentives, right? There's two reasons that you want to coordinate. One is you'd like to collude on prices. Okay, right now, today in Chicago, you don't make a lot of money selling drugs. Okay, I've been doing some work in Chicago. I have some violence reduction work, but we also wrote a short paper because we had a little bit of data on how much sort of core gang members and the shooters within gang members were earning. And they're earning better than minimum wage, but not by much. All right, it's not a very profitable enterprise, and it's kind of a part-time job. It's not that desirable a job. Okay, however, back in the day, when there was a much smaller number of structures, and there was a lot more control over the street price, and there wasn't a lot of competition. You didn't have internet deals. You didn't have like some guy you could phone up on your mobile, and you didn't have people in the suburbs who would deliver to your home and so forth. There was a set of centralized marketplaces. They had a lot of control over the price. They could set a price that was higher than the competitive price, maybe close to the monopolistic price, and make all these rents. Basically grab all this consumer and producer surplus. Okay, and so this is essentially huge. If you can coordinate, not just across all the combos in your neighborhood under a raison, meaning people have to walk really far to get drugs at a different price, but if you can actually manage citywide collusion and all agree to sell at roughly the same price, even though there's a fair amount of product differentiation, right, then you can actually, as a raison, get that price something that's close to like an oligopolistic or monopolistic price, capture a huge amount of rents. And then as a raison, if you have a lot of leverage vis-a-vis the combos, and you're the one coordinating all of this, or you're the militarily stronger or the politically more influential actor, you can offer combos a wholesale price that's relatively close to the retail price, and then capture most of those monopolistic profits for yourself. And that's generally what happens. There's actually a lot of within raison variation in how much their combos what wholesale price does that perico or that marijuana get sold to the combo? And the combo tends to get a better wholesale price if they've got either military or political or social bargaining power. But the really important thing is conflict management, because what's to stop these 400 organizations sort of competing violently in anarchy for drugs? Okay, and so what the razones are doing is they're creating this sort of sophisticated structure of conflict management. So basically, and I'm going to get back into that in a second, but essentially they're keeping combos from fighting one another. And that's extremely valuable because you no longer have to invest in defense. You no longer have to worry about getting killed. The homicide rate in Medellín is about 1/3 of the homicide rate in Chicago, which is already, I'd say, moderate for an American city in the sense of the Americas, compared to 20 years ago, 25 years ago when Medellín was the most violent place in the world. So this is extremely valuable. And so all of these sort of push towards having one, maybe not one super organization, but why wouldn't we just have vertical integration of the razones over their combos? Why don't we have a whole bunch of Trianas rather than all of these sort of fragmented like Toyota dealerships? Okay, and one of the main reasons I've already talked about is the state predation is pushing towards fragmentation. All right, so you can't write things down, you don't want confiscatable assets, so you don't have physical infrastructure, you don't put in security cameras for your security operation, you don't buy a lot of things that are going to help you manufacture and produce and sell, you don't create storefronts, it restricts your marketing and branding, it actually limits your ability to recruit, and so forth. And so this is essentially a force, and it seems to be that there's, basically you get beyond 30, 40 people, and it's hard to keep it all in your head. Is basically what it comes down to. And so you don't even necessarily see horizontal integration of combos across neighborhoods into, say, a combo of 100. All right, it's very, very rare. There's one or two instances, but they're very, very rare. So instead of having these vertically integrated firms, we draw on a concept from international relations that says we have hegemonic alliances. That means there's a hegemon, the raison, and that creates a confederation of combos. Right, the Toyota dealership, partly to sort of protect against this, right? And so that's very important for conflict management as well, because now you, instead of having 400 combos trying to negotiate with and bargain over borders all the time, now you have about 17 razones, and it's even better than that because you have two main alliances. And so now conflict management is about bilateral bargaining between powerful hegemons rather than 17 hegemons trying to negotiate, or 400 firms trying to negotiate. Okay, and that's a lot like the world we live in. We don't live in a world with 200 nations in anarchy. We live in a world with 4 or 5 hegemonic alliances led by, like the EU and the US and Russia and China and so forth. And then we don't even live in a world of just 5 actors. We actually live in a world of where there's essentially an axis, and some powers have allied with others, and so we have something that looks akin to bilateral bargaining. All right, and that bilateral bargaining is really helpful towards peace. Peace is an equilibrium typically in bilateral bargaining. Multilateral bargaining with many actors, peace is not necessarily an equilibrium in a Nash sense. Okay, and so this is very helpful to have this kind of structure. And so as a result, Medellín went from being one of the most now this was a period of civil war, and you could go watch Narcos, and not just civil war, but then on top of civil war, Pablo Escobar deciding, hey, maybe I can go to war against the state, right? That didn't work, all right? So they stopped warring against the state, but it was still a very violent place, just war between gangs. And then somebody came in and like organized it. Then they extradited him, and then violence went up for a little while, but within 2 or 3 years, everyone was like, this is way too costly. We need to reinstitute La Oficina and the organizations created and create these criminal institutions. And it's driven the homicide rate down and down and down and down and down. Chicago, okay, this is one big raison called the University of Chicago, which you'll recognize. So the neighborhood, which direction? So south of here, Woodlawn, in the 70s. So this is very similar type of evolution that happened in Chicago in the 70s, 80s, 90s. So Woodlawn, through the 1950s and 60s, you saw the emergence of black youth gangs. And this was an area of somewhat anarchy because there are dozens of gangs and they're engaged in constant fighting. Now, there weren't a lot of drugs yet and there weren't a lot of guns, and so there wasn't a lot of particularly lethal violence. But that started to grow through the 60s and 70s. As the drug market sort of started to emerge. So what happened? Well, there was a little gang at the corner of Blackstone and 63rd, known as the Black Pea Stones. And the Black Pea Stones essentially became the raison. And now they call themselves a nation. So in Chicago we call them nations, not razones. And Black Pea Stones organized all the gangs, and they stopped this civil war or this infighting that was happening. They created peace within Woodlawn. Then they colonized parts of many of the major projects, and they became one of the main 5 or 6 main nations in Chicago in the 70s, 80s, 90s, controlled the drug trade. And so they ran, and so that if you were in a set of projects controlled by the Pea Stones, you weren't fighting with the building next to you because they were also Pea Stones. Okay, they also, who are you fighting? Well, you might be fighting the Black Disciples. So you know where the CVS is, just up here, right? So that was a set of projects. And there was a guy named David Barksdale. So I don't know if this is where Avon Barksdale, the name comes from in The Wire, but David Barksdale was basically a teenager living in that set of projects, which subsequently got demolished. He founded the Black Disciples. The Black Disciples, or the BDs, became, again, one of the huge gang nations that organized many of the smaller gangs. And today, even to this day, have organized a great deal of Englewood. Okay, and so you had the BDs and the Black Pea Stones and the Gangster Disciples and the Latin Kings and the Vice Lords and a handful of others. And so what we had in Chicago was a series of nations that essentially vertically integrated to some degree their local gangs. And violence in that period was not civil war amongst hundreds of Chicago street factions. It was international warfare between these 5 or 6 nations. And those nations started to spread, and so they started going to Minneapolis and St. Louis. And you will find Black Pea Stone and BD and Gangster Disciple and other chapters throughout the Midwest. Also, most of you have heard the Crips and the Bloods. The Bloods are a colonial offshoot of the Black Pea Stones. One of the guys who moved out to LA started that, and then they renamed themselves. They became known as the Bloods. But the Bloods all originate from Blackstone and 63rd. And so this is very common. You see this throughout. People talk about like the PCC in Brazil or the Maras in El Salvador, and as if they're like some huge conglomerate, and as if there's just 2 factions fighting. And that's partly true. There's 2 nations or 2 razones or 2 alliances, but they are loose alliances and confederations of many smaller local organizations. Right? And what happened in Chicago from about the late 19th onwards is, unlike Medellín, where they essentially the government, in some sense, cooperated with this pacification and allowed these organizations to remain strong, Chicago took the opposite route. It just relentlessly cut off the heads of all of these organizations, not just the big nations, but also the smaller organizations. And it refragmented them into a situation where now you go to Englewood, or now you go to, well, Woodlawn doesn't really have this issue so much any longer, but you go to Woodlawn, you go to North Lawndale, elsewhere, and we're back to this world of civil warfare between factions that used to maybe be both Vice Lords or both BDs, and are back to sort of fighting because there's no political structure or market structure above them that's trying to prevent this from happening. Because if you do, you find yourself in jail. There's other reasons that led to the fragmentation, the destruction of the projects, the increased competition in drug markets. There's lots of things going on. There's terrific books about this if you're interested, but it's a very common. But that's what happened in Chicago. We're starting to see the same thing happening in Haiti. Haiti's gone from a system of fragmented gangs into a set of razones, essentially, that control their factions. And now they've unified into two major alliances. And those alliances also have a governing table. And that governing table, they're still fighting amongst one another, so they haven't created peace by any stretch. But they organized enough to oust the prime minister. All right, and this is still an issue today. All right, so this can help us. This sort of like structure, this market structure and political structure of organized crime can help us understand, like, city after city after city. And then whether or not there's violence or not has a lot to do with government policy. So we could talk about Chicago. We could talk about the New York five families in the mafia through the 30s through the 90s. More vertically integrated, so in Rio, Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo actually doesn't have two alliances. One superfaction has managed to essentially become the criminal monopolist and organized all of the factions under the PCC. And so Sao Paulo, despite being one of the most criminal cities in the hemisphere, like Medellín, is one of the most peaceful, right? Because it's figured this out. But Rio's not figured that out. For a long time, the gangs of El Salvador had not figured it out, although they did manage a peace. Everybody, if you're familiar with El Salvador and Bucalismo and the idea that Bukele brought peace to El Salvador by imprisoning all the gang members, that's not really true. Right? El Salvador was peaceful, more or less, for 2 years before he imprisoned everybody. Why? Because he and the three main Mata factions sat down and negotiated a peace. They did the same thing that's happened in Sao Paulo and the same thing that's happened in Medellín to a degree. And then Bukele realized that he could sort of exploit a moment of weakness. He got lucky and he managed to lock everybody up. Criminals plus, unfortunately, a bunch of non-criminals. All right, and so he essentially ran an end run around them and took advantage of these highly centralized structures. Right, and so that's maybe going to lead to sustainable peace. We have no idea, but it wasn't what brought about the peace. It was this negotiation and this desire to have strong, powerful criminal factions, but and to tolerate them by negotiation. Okay, so I'm only 5 minutes. So basically, like, what happened? Like, where did this emerge? Well, it's not like the Officina just was emerged, wholesale, right? These institutions, these hierarchical structures, these hegemonic alliances, evolved over time, over the course of 20 or 25 years. They have a whole set of rules and norms that they've agreed upon. So it started with no killing civilians. It then moved to no killing police. Now, if you want to kill someone, you're allowed to kill someone. You have to ask permission up the chain. There's some agreement about how you dispose of bodies and so forth. And so all of these norms and rules had to be developed, and they had to learn how to collectively enforce them and how to create effective organization. So there's an immense amount of informal criminal institution building, which happened over this period that really helped sort of maintain the peace. I could talk about, there were similar attempts in Chicago in the 80s and 90s to sort of create similar negotiated solutions. There's a great book called The Insane Chicago Way about how the Italian mob sent like a diplomat to the Latin gangs and the Latin nations in Chicago to sort of say, guys, you're not making any money. If you just get it together, you'll be able to stop fighting. And so they tried to create their own officina. They called it SGD, Spanish Growth and Development, which is my favorite factoid about Chicago, right? Because that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to get rich. All right, and it fell apart. It's hard to build these criminal institutions, especially if the state doesn't help. What did the state do what has the state done in Colombia? Well, the state's done, I think, things in a very principled way. They haven't sort of had secret negotiations and say, hey, you keep your criminal profits and you keep the streets safe. Some places do that. That's essentially what Bukele did in El Salvador, okay? They do certain things. First of all, they do something called conditional repression, or they basically sanction. They say, look, if you're violent, we're going to spend our resources cracking down on your gang. And so that gives gangs at every level an incentive to find a way to control the violence because they don't want the limited state capacity to direct it in their direction. Okay, and so that provides an automatic incentive to somehow control the violence. The second thing they do is only semi-deliberately, they keep the heads together in prison. So many of the prisons have leaders' wings, and the leaders are grouped together in those wings. And even if they're in separate wings, they maintain some of their hierarchical structures within the prison, and they manage to control their gangs from prison. So most of the top leadership of the Razones are all in one of 3 prisons within Medellín's urban area. All right, partly this reduces wars of succession because they remain in charge. All right, this being in prison gives them a long time horizon. Also, they have to sit next to their enemy, so they don't want to be at war. And it also facilitates negotiations and communications. And only in a handful of instances has the government been really sort of heavy-handed in their efforts to create peace. In 2019, in the beginning of the year, homicide started to spike because basically the two factions, the two alliances said, you know what, here's this part of the city, we're not really sure how powerful, let's let them fight it out, and then we'll sort of figure out the borders. Usually we like carve up the borders according to how power changes without a fight. Let's let them fight it out, we're not sure how powerful they are and who deserves this territory. And that started to actually get out of control. And the homicide rate basically went up by, it was down, if this went back further, it was down, so the homicide rate basically doubled. And so coincidentally, on the same day, all leaders that were in prison from every Medellín faction were transferred to a new prison on the same day, which meant that for 3 or 4 days, they all had to put in the same holding area before they went on. And then coincidentally, somebody got arrested and put in that holding area who was a trusted intermediary between these guys. And then coincidentally, and there's some ultimatum that was given. We know this from talking to the criminals. We don't actually know, the state won't talk to us about this. But basically, they basically were like, you guys are going to settle this, with an agreement. You're going to come to a negotiated solution, or your lives in prison are going to be less pleasant. So a form of conditional repression. The other strategy, which was what people sort of attribute to buculismo, but also less successfully in lots of countries, including Mexico, and somewhat less successfully in Chicago, is a sort of hard-hitting mano duro approach. So that's what they did in Chicago, just cut off the heads. It's not conditional repression. It's not keeping the heads together. In Chicago, they were like, I don't care if you're a violent leader or a non-violent leader, we're going to get rid of you. All right, we're going to create a whole set of fragmented groups. We're going to decimate, we're going to make you completely unprofitable and marginalize you in your communities. And you're not going to be able to run this from prison because we're going to put you in a Colorado Supermax. We're not going to let you sit in an Illinois prison and run your outfit and be with your gang members. And that had the benefit of decimating these criminal structures, right? Which is really important. We don't have huge, super powerful, the richest people in Chicago are not the head of these, nations. All right, but it does mean that there's a whole bunch of fragmented groups that nobody controls. And there's just a bunch of 16-year-olds running around, competing a little bit for drug territory, basically subject to a bunch of rivalries, self-protection, reputation building, and shooting one another to maintain some, semblance of we get into this, but a form of like low-level violence that helps avoid large-scale war. All right, and so that's not a great situation either, but you don't necessarily want to be in the situation of Medellín where it's peaceful, but you have some of the most powerful people in the city are criminals. And so this sort of gets to this sort of idea of this terrible trade-off, which is where I'll stop, which is that you kind of have this dilemma then as a mayor. Now, if you're a mayor of a city like Bogota or New York or somewhere where you actually don't have well-established street gangs and criminal networks, you're in a great position, especially if the retail drug market has not really emerged. Your number one focus should be on eliminating that market from developing. Right? But if you're in one of these cities with established gangs, you really face this terrible trade-off between, do you want to end up like Medellín? Do you want to end up like Chicago? Or maybe the worst of both worlds, northern Mexico or Rio, where you're both like going to war against these groups sort of unsuccessfully and so there's no terrible trade-off, it's just terrible decisions all around because you're acting ignorantly. And so there isn't really a good story, and you can understand peace or violence through a lot of cities in this hemisphere based on whether or not the government has any idea how this works, and if they're making these choices sort of naively in an unconditional oppression way and then getting lots of violence, or if they're being sophisticated about it and then making a choice about what kind of city do they want. I will leave it at that.